Many people are unaware, but the Bible speaks extensively about the origins and history of the Iranian people. The territory of modern Iran, known in ancient times as Persia and previously as Elam, is significantly mentioned in the biblical narrative during the Old Testament times. In fact, the story of the early Iranian peoples starts from the earliest accounts recorded in the book of Genesis and spans various significant periods, including the formation of great empires that directly interacted with the Israelites. Understanding the relationships between these peoples is important for interpreting many of the events described in the Old Testament, as well as their effects and consequences throughout history. In this video, we will attempt to provide a brief historical overview of who the ancient Iranians were during biblical times and what true contact this people had with the Israelites. We will also explore whether in any way the origin of the Iranian people and their contact with the people of Israel during biblical times is part of a prophetic and eschatological framework for the end times. We will begin this story from the Bronze Age, progressing to the Persian dominion during and after the Babylonian exile. In Genesis 10:22, in the list of nations, Elam is mentioned as one of the descendants of Shem and became one of the first kingdoms established after the flood. This ancient kingdom, located east of the Tigris River, is cited several times in the scriptures. Notably, the prophet Isaiah mentioned Elam in his prophecy as one of the places where God would gather the remnant of his people, Isaiah 11:11. Geographically, Elam occupied a region that is part of southwestern Iran today. This strategic location made Elam a center of culture and power in antiquity, with influences extending to Mesopotamia. Historically, Elam was both an adversary and an ally of various regional powers, including the Babylonians and Assyrians. Although direct interactions between Elam and the tribes of Israel are less documented, the kingdom of Elam was contemporary to the periods of the patriarchs and judges in Israel. The presence of the Elamites is more significantly observed as adversaries in battle accounts and as part of the empires that influenced the history of Israel. Moving forward in history, the strengthening of the Iranian peoples of the northwest occurred with the rise of the Median Empire. For some scholars, especially based on materials from the historian Herodotus, it was between approximately the late 8th century BC and the mid-7th century BC that the unification of the Iranian tribes as a nation under the rule of Dyaus, a semi-legendary figure often credited with the foundation of the Median dynasty and the Median Empire, first occurred. Once in power, Dyaus is said to have undertaken the task of unifying the various Median tribes. He implemented a series of administrative and legal reforms, establishing a code of laws and a centralized government structure. These measures were essential in creating a common identity among the tribes, which previously operated quite autonomously and dispersedly. Indeed, the unification of the Median tribes had a significant impact on the region, as it laid the groundwork for the development of a more cohesive Median identity and subsequent territorial expansion under kings such as Cyaxares and Astyages. But first, we need to talk about the greatest power of the time, the Assyrian Empire. This empire is often mentioned in the Old Testament as an agent of divine judgment on Israel and other nations. The Assyrian Empire stood out for its extraordinary military and administrative capacity, extending its dominion from Mesopotamia to Egypt at its peak. Its relationship with Israel was predominantly hostile, marked by campaigns that resulted in large deportations and an attempt to eradicate the Israelite identity. It was under the Assyrians that the kingdom of Israel fell, resulting in the exile of the 10 northern tribes. However, part of the Assyrian offensives also reached the Iranian plateau, intervening in territories belonging to the Medes. However, by the end of the 7th century BC, the Assyrian Empire began to decline due to a series of internal problems, including power struggles, weakened administration, and continuous pressure from subjugated peoples. In this context, while Assyrian power waned, the Medes began to gain strength. Cyaxares, king of the Medes, took advantage of the Assyrians' weakness to expand his territory and influence. The Medes eventually allied with the Babylonians, led by Nabopolassar, to put an end to the long years of Assyrian dominion in the region. Cyaxares and Nabopolassar formed a strategic alliance, which also included other Iranian groups such as the Scythians and the Cimmerians. These peoples shared a common interest in seeing the fall of the Assyrians, and were willing to collaborate to achieve this goal. The Scythians and the Cimmerians, known for their cavalry skills and guerrilla tactics, brought a new dimension to the military capability of the alliance. The campaign against Assyria was characterized by a series of decisive battles and prolonged sieges. In 612 BC, the alliance achieved one of its greatest successes with the siege and destruction of Nineveh, the grandiose Assyrian capital. This event was foretold by the prophet Isaiah as an act of divine judgment. The fall of Nineveh and the subsequent collapse of the Assyrian Empire paved the way for the emergence of new powers. The Medes consolidated their control over much of Iran and adjacent areas, while Nabopolassar and his son, Nebuchadnezzar II, established the Neo-Babylonian Empire as a major force in Mesopotamia. The rise of the Medes and Babylonians symbolized an important transition of powers in the region, directly influencing the political context in which the Jewish people were embedded. But to continue the history of the Iranian peoples in biblical times, we need to talk about the Neo-Babylonian Empire. After all, the prophet Isaiah also prophesied that the Medes would be God's instrument for the destruction of Babylon. Isaiah 13:17. The Neo-Babylonian Empire was marked mainly by the dominant figure of Nebuchadnezzar II. This empire was widely known for its destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, as documented in various historical and prophetic texts of the Old Testament. This event culminated with the destruction of Solomon's temple and the exile of the Jewish people, and was a period of profound theological and cultural implications for Judah, detailed in the book of Daniel. King Nebuchadnezzar imposed a policy of deportation and cultural assimilation aimed not only at punishing Judah, but also at integrating the Jews into the wider empire, diluting potential future resistances. Thus, the capture of Judah was not just an act of conquest, but an attempt at geopolitical and cultural reorganization of his vast imperial expanse. During the Neo-Babylonian period, the Iranian peoples were experiencing a significant time of transition and rise. While the Babylonians were focused on managing their empire and campaigns against Judah and other states, the Medes to the north were consolidating their power, having established a kingdom that would serve as the core for the future alliance with the Persians. Thus, under the leadership of Cyaxares and later Astyages, the Medes organized a state that began to significantly influence regional politics. This phase was crucial in establishing the foundations for what would become the impressive Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great, which would eventually absorb and succeed both Media and Babylon. The foundation of the Achaemenid Empire began with the rise of Cyrus the Great, following the Persian revolt against the Medes, which eventually subdued Astyages, the last Median king. Cyrus was a representative of the dynasty of the legendary Achaemenids and became notable for his diplomatic and military skills, characteristics that allowed him to rapidly expand his territory. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BC is one of Cyrus's most celebrated feats. He entered the city without facing significant resistance after a relatively short siege. The peaceful takeover of Babylon was crucial not only strategically but also politically, as Cyrus promoted an image of liberator rather than conqueror. He allowed exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their lands and rebuild their temples, a policy that secured the loyalty of local populations and helped stabilize his vast empire. In this way, Cyrus became known for his policy of tolerance and restoration of subjugated peoples. This was a revolutionary approach for the time that contrasted with the practices of previous empires. Indeed, the rise of the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great marked a crucial point in biblical history. especially in relation to the people of Judah. Cyrus was proclaimed in Isaiah 45:1 as the anointed of the Lord, an essential figure in the fulfillment of divine promises. Cyrus's decree in 538 BC, which allowed the exiled Jews to return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, is documented in the book of Ezra. Additionally, the figure of Cyrus as anointed of the Lord extends the concept of messianism, traditionally associated only with Israelite leaders, to a Gentile king. This highlights the universality of God's salvation plan and his sovereignty over all kingdoms of the earth. The use of a Persian king to liberate the Jews underscores that God operates through all nations and individuals to fulfill his sovereign purposes. The very permission for the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem under the Persian rule of the Achaemenid Empire not only restored the religious and cultural identity of the Jewish people, but also reaffirmed the covenant between God and his people, showing divine faithfulness and the continuity of his promises. While Judah experienced restoration, the Persian Empire was in full expansion and consolidation. At its peak, the Achaemenid Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen, having more than 40% of the world's population under its rule. After the death of Cyrus and a brief period of reign by his son Cambyses II, Darius I ascended the throne in 522 BC after suppressing several internal revolts that threatened the stability of the empire. Darius is known for his extraordinary administrative ability. He reorganized the empire into several provinces, or satrapies, each governed by a satrap appointed by him. This administrative structure improved the efficiency of government and allowed more effective control over the vast Achaemenid territories. Darius also implemented a uniform tax system and promoted the construction of roads and infrastructure, such as the famous Royal Road, which facilitated communication and trade throughout the empire. Moreover, he expanded the empire further to include parts of India, Thrace, and the Indus Valley. It was during the reign of Darius I that the prophets Haggai and Zechariah prophesied, and the Second Temple was rebuilt in Jerusalem under the leadership of Zerubbabel. Darius I was succeeded by his son, Xerxes I, who is identified in biblical history with King Ahasuerus of the Book of Esther. The Book of Esther, incidentally, provides a more internal portrait of the Persian court and describes a period when the Jews were living under the threat of extermination by Haman, a high official of King Ahasuerus. In this context, a young Jewish exile named Hadassah, who also received the Persian name Esther, was surprisingly elevated to the position of Queen of Persia and played a crucial role in protecting her people. With courage and cunning, she revealed Haman's conspiracy to the Persian king, which eventually led to Haman's execution and the exaltation of her cousin Mordecai to a position of influence in the court of the Achaemenid Empire. In this way, the story of Esther illustrates not only the integration of Jews into Persian society, but also divine providence and the idea that God places people in strategic positions to fulfill his purposes. Later, when Artaxerxes I, son of Xerxes, ascended the throne, an important part of Jewish history unfolded. This period was marked by the actions of Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra was a priest and scribe who led the second group of exiles returning to Jerusalem under the sponsorship of King Artaxerxes I. Ezra was tasked with restoring the Mosaic law and reforming the Jewish community that was deviating from its religious traditions after the return from exile. The Book of Ezra recounts his role in reconstituting religious and cultural life, reaffirming the Torah as the foundation of Jewish identity and practice. On the other hand, Nehemiah was a highly trusted cupbearer of Artaxerxes I, who became governor of Judah. He became known for his leadership in rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, a project that symbolized the restoration of the city's dignity and security in that context. The authorization and support of Artaxerxes for the ventures of Ezra and Nehemiah demonstrate the Persian approach to governance at the time, which allowed some local autonomy while maintaining imperial control. The Persian Empire finally came to an end in the face of the conquests of Alexander the Great in 331 BC and the establishment of his vast empire. However, with the death of Alexander the Great, his empire was divided among his generals, and from this fragmentation, three main Hellenistic kingdoms emerged: the Ptolemaic in Egypt, the Seleucid in Asia Minor, and the Antigonid in Macedonia and Greece. Then, the region that is today Iran was dominated by the Seleucid Empire, which controlled a large area that included most of the Near East. Seleucid governance in that territory was marked by a policy of Hellenization. This included the founding of Greek-style cities and the promotion of Greek religious and cultural practices. However, attempts at Hellenization encountered significant resistance, especially from native populations who insisted on maintaining their cultural and religious traditions. This combative approach of the Seleucids resulted in constant challenges, both internal and external, including tensions with the Ptolemaic and Antigonid kingdoms, as well as local revolts, such as the Maccabean revolt in Judea. By the 3rd century BC, the Parthians, who were a people of Iranian origin, capitalized on the growing dissatisfaction with the Seleucids to establish their own empire. Thus, the Parthian Empire began to ascend as a powerful force in the Iran region. The Parthians were known for their heavy cavalry and archery skills, which allowed them to resist both the Romans and the Seleucids. The Parthian Empire maintained many Iranian traditions and promoted Zoroastrianism as the state religion, which helped strengthen the Iranian cultural identity after the period of Hellenization. It is worth noting here that the most influential and enduring religion in ancient Iran was indeed Zoroastrianism. This religion taught that humans had the duty to choose between good and evil, with their decisions affecting their ultimate fate. The religion also promoted purification rituals and offerings of sacrifices, and had a strong emphasis on moral order and social justice, which in some ways was reflected in its influence on the laws and governmental practices of the empires that adopted this belief. Succeeding the Parthians, the Sassanids established their empire in AD 224, when the last Parthian king was overthrown. The Sassanid Empire revitalized Persian culture and traditions, reintroducing and reinforcing many aspects of the ancient Achaemenid Empire. The Sassanids were great rivals of the Roman Empire, and later, the Byzantine Empire. They were known for their efficient administration, their road and city infrastructure, and the flourishing of Zoroastrianism, which was promoted as a unifying and identity-forming element throughout the empire. However, at the beginning of the 7th century AD, the Arab invasion of Iran took advantage of the weakening of the Sassanid Empire, resulting in Islamic dominance over the region. The Islamization of Iran was not immediate, but occurred gradually over several generations. Zoroastrianism, although initially tolerated, began to be increasingly marginalized, with many Iranians converting to Islam, attracted by both the social and economic aspects and the new power structure. Eventually, Islam replaced Zoroastrianism as the dominant religion, profoundly shaping the cultural and religious identity of modern Iran. As it becomes clear from this overview, the Iranian and Israelite histories have had significant contacts over time. But from a biblical perspective, is there still more to happen between these two nations? Within some branches of Christianity, especially those that adopt a futuristic perspective of biblical eschatology, Iran, as the heir to ancient Persia, is often discussed in the context of eschatological prophecies involving Israel. These interpretations are based on biblical passages that are seen as possibly referring to future events involving these nations. One of the most cited texts is Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39, which describes a great battle involving Gog of Magog, leading a coalition of nations against Israel. Although Persia is explicitly mentioned as one of the nations allied with Gog, the exact identification of Magog and the interpretation of the symbolism in this prophecy vary widely among scholars and theologians. Some futurist interpreters see this reference to Persia as an indication that modern Iran will play a significant role in future conflicts against Israel. This view is influenced by the contemporary political context, in which tensions between Israel and Iran are often reported, and Iran is seen as one of Israel's main adversaries in the Middle East. Parts of the book of Daniel are also remembered in this discussion, particularly the chapters that describe the visions of the four world empires and the subsequent coming of God's kingdom. Daniel 8, for example, details a confrontation between a ram with two horns, representing the kings of Media and Persia, and a goat representing the king of Greece. Some futuristic interpretations relate these figures to modern or future events, seeing them as symbolic of principles or forces still in action today. Theologically, the futuristic eschatological approach that incorporates modern nations into biblical prophecies can be both fascinating and controversial. While on the one hand, it emphasizes the belief in the ongoing relevance of Scripture to contemporary events, on the other, it can easily fall into the error of overstating direct connections between ancient texts and modern political contexts. This often results in interpretations that are overly speculative or influenced by modern readings of biblical texts. Despite these discussions about Iran, Israel, and eschatological prophecies reflecting the desire of many Christians to understand God's plans for the future, this does not give them the right to mark dates and events on God's agenda, as unfortunately many end up doing. Undoubtedly, any and all conflicts are part of the fulfillment of the warning given by the Lord Jesus Christ that history would be marked by wars and rumors of war. And since Jesus spoke those words, the world has never known what it is to have complete and lasting peace. However, this strictly speculative approach often ends up causing people to lose focus on the true biblical message about such topics. For example, in this video we explored the biblical origin of the Iranian peoples and their complex relations with neighboring nations, including the Israelites, from the ancient Elamites in the Bronze Age to the impactful Persian Empire. But instead of focusing on trying to find prophetic codes in these biblical passages that supposedly allow us to relate them specifically to modern events, we should focus our attention on the manifestation of divine providence throughout this history. These prophecies and biblical records, indeed, present God as the supreme author of history, who uses both adversity and prosperity to fulfill his divine purposes. In other words, the central message that runs through all these biblical accounts and prophecies is undoubtedly the sovereignty of God over all nations and historical events. The Scriptures consistently exalt God's ability to raise up kingdoms and bring them down according to his will, using them as instruments to fulfill his divine purposes, whether to discipline, purify, or restore his people. God is not a distant observer, but an active participant in human history, guiding events to the realization of his redemptive plan. This perspective should lead us to a deeper faith and a life oriented by the confidence that, regardless of the turbulence and apparent chaos of the world around us, we are under the governance of a sovereign and infinitely wise God. Recognizing the sovereignty and wisdom of God in the course of history helps us maintain our spiritual peace and focus on living according to his commandments and promoting the kingdom of God here on earth, rather than being consumed by anxiety about the future.